Merci beaucoup. It's a pleasure to speak to you, Andrew. And yes, I certainly cook with a French accent, as well as speak with a French accent.
If you haven't worked out already from the title of today's fabulously delicious episode, this is part one of a two-part chat with today's guest. A food icon of mine from growing up in Australia, Gabriel Gaté will be known by many of you. But if you haven't heard of Gabriel before, well, then you're in for a real treat. In episode one, we will chat about life in France as a child, apprenticing at a Michelin-starred restaurant, working in some of the best restaurants in the world. He might have started his career in France, but then he's moved to Australia. And in that time, he's been able to call some of the best chefs in the world his friend. So stay tuned, grab a baguette, some cheese and wine for this, the fabulously delicious with Gabriel Gaté. Bonjour, this is Fabulously Delicious, the podcast that's all about delicious French food and the people that love it, cook it, produce it, talk, write and photograph it. French food and seafood, fish in particular, you realise when you come to France, go hand in hand as much as cheese and wine. You can be in the middle of France in the countryside and there'll be a fishmonger, or poissonnaire as they call them here, at the market right next to the butchers and the fromageries. So today we're going to be getting a little fishy on Fabulously Delicious. I can't tell you how excited I am with my next guest. He is a French food icon in Australia and around the world thanks to his fabulous show that followed the Tour de France every year. A successful cookbook author, accomplished chef, and now an all-round Australian. With a French twist, of course, a little bit like me. Gabriel Gaté, thanks for joining me on Fabulously Delicious.
Merci beaucoup. It's a pleasure to speak to you, Andrew. And yes, I certainly cook with a French accent, as well as speak with a French accent.
Right, great. So you obviously then, by your accent, you were born in France. So whereabouts were you born?
I was born on the Loire Valley. The Loire is the largest river in France, going from practically east uh, to west, and the Loire goes into the Atlantic. It's a very large river. It's the longest in France, the widest, not the biggest flow. It's very hard for tourists to go on the river. There's little spots, but there's no big tourist attraction from the middle of the river. But the side of the river is wonderful because we have the chateaus of the kings. We have the region is called the Garden of France. Fabulous for fruits, for vegetables, for goat cheese, and great wines.
Being a young child in an area like that, it must have been idyllic to grow up in that area in France.
Yes, it is lovely. It is also a region that has got a reasonably mild climate compared to some other regions, like if you are in the Alps or in the Massif Central or in the north of France. We get a little bit of the Atlantic air, so it stops it from being too cold in winter. It is still cold, but not no, it's not as bad as in the mountain. And in summer, it's very nicely mild. It gets hot, but not very hot. So it's really good for agriculture.
So you mentioned the chateaus before. Amongst other things, it's what the Loire is definitely known for. So were there chateaus around where you lived?
Yeah, yes. There was a chateau in my town, just about 300 meters from my place. That is now more than 1,000 years old. At some, so it is. Catherine de Medici stayed there for a night with her husband, the King of France, on their way to
Just one night?
just for one night. Because remember,
Oh,
at that time they were traveling with horses and carriage. So they stayed in on their way to with the local noble people, and we had the Duke. Uh, there's still a Duke in that has a chateau in the region, and so it was he had good connection, and Catherine stayed a few hundred meters from my place. A few hundred years before me.
right. I suppose that means that the chateaus were the Airbnb for the rich of their time.
Absolutely, absolutely. That was
Right.
the stop for any, if you were traveling from one part of France, you probably did a number of I don't know, many kilometers they could do every day. Maybe, changing horse, maybe quite a few. But yeah, and they would have good local wines, good local food. The Duke they always had cooks, of course.
Of course.
And Catherine de Medici is important in European cuisine was really important because she loved food and she brought some cooks from Italy with her that loved that were good technicians, but they loved the food that they saw in France, that and the cheeses and the great fish and everything.
So, with your family, was there anyone in particular then that was involved in food as a career, or?
It's very common, of course, for French family, especially in my town. We lived. Everyone had a smaller house, and everyone had a big garden because basically you grew all the vegetables for the family. It was not, like it was seen as very lazy not to grow your own vegetables. So you had a big garden surrounded uh, by fruit trees. In our case, we had lots of pear trees, we had plums, but we also had a small vineyard because it's a wine region. My father made the wine. I helped him many times. We all contributed for the pruning in winter, for the harvesting, and so we learned to make wine. And around the vineyards, there was also lots of fruit trees, so that allowed us to make a spirit, which with all the fruits that we had. We had a license because of we had so many trees that we were allowed to make a spirit using the fruits that were not damaged or not eatable or that are starting to rot. In my family, I must say also that we lived with my grandmother, and my grandmother had been the private chef in a well-to-do family for all her youth. And her sister was also doing the same occupation. Her sister was working in Paris for the Rothschild family. So there was a good history of good cooks, good home cooks, good home cooks. They were not professional chefs. The approach to cooking was very different. They cooked with what there was, of course, locally, and they would not make the same mise en place. They would cook a dish or two for families. They would not cook, à la carte or anything, but they were really good cooks because they had lots of experience, benefiting from many generations before them.
Would they have not been able to become a professional chef at that time? Was it just that they had families to look after themselves? So
You could if you had your own restaurants, and it was very much the case at that time.
okay,
My grandmother was born in 1894, and she in the region, and she got a job with that family that they were millers. They grinded flour on the side of the river because you had the electricity with the river. And my grandmother started when she was like 12 or 13, and she was an assistant cook. And over the years, she became a cook. But when she was 20, she married, 1914. Her husband went to the war and never came back. And the same with her sister. So suddenly, two sisters, my grandmother 20, a sister 22, 23, a sister pregnant, and so they went back to their employments, and my grandmother stayed another 10 years with that family, and I suppose that's where she really became a very fine cook as a young woman that was responsible to cook for about 20 to 25 people a day, several meals, very seasonal, cooking the fish from the river. That was a really big thing. The pikes, the salmon, the perch, and of course the seafood from the seaside, which is not very far in our case. We live more on the Atlantic side than the center of France. Yeah.
and so is there any particular dish that was your favorite that your grandmother used to cook?
Oh, well, the great specialty of the region was poached fish with beurre blanc sauce. The beurre blanc sauce is right in my region. The beurre blanc sauce is an extraordinary sauce, made with shallots that is cooked slowly in white wine and vinegar. Chop the shallots, cook it. We call it almost a confit, like you cook it until all the liquid has evaporated and it is sweet and sour. And then to that you add, in the pan a little bit of water, and slowly you whisk in some cold batter until the sauce is holding together. You get an emulsion, and it is a wonderful sauce for fish in particular, but also for vegetables like asparagus, which was the big specialty of the region, especially the white asparagus and the artichokes and the cauliflower. But the great specialty was that beurre blanc sauce.
Right. And so in restaurants, it's known, pretty much around the world that the saucier was the most important person
Absolutely.
in a restaurant.
Yeah.
And you've worked in some amazing restaurants, which we'll get to soon. But in your experience, then, how do you compare your grandmother's beurre blanc to some of the beurre blancs you possibly had in some of the best restaurants around the world?
Well, not only that, but after that, when I decided to become a chef, I asked one of my teacher, what should I do? He sent me to the best local chef, who was known as the king of the beurre blanc. And like the guy that you came wherever you were, this was the guy, that you would, the restaurant you would come to taste what a beurre blanc should taste like. So I did my apprenticeship with him for 2.5 years, and it was one Michelin star. But at that time, in the country restaurants, it was not a large brigade. There was 3 apprentices, there was a commis, and there was the chef. And Albert Augereau, his name was. He was a maître cuisinier de France, which means a master chef. He had done lots of competition. He was a good friend with Paul Bocuse, with the Trois Gros brothers. Um, and he was really a master of his region, an absolute master. He knew, his family had been in the region for a long time. The restaurant had a Michelin star restaurant for 50 years in a row, so that's a big block. And we got the fresh salmon from the local fishermen. We got the shallots that were necessary from the local garden. We got the local batter of Échiré, which is not very far from where you are living. We got the white wine to cook from the Loire Valley. So it was really regional cuisine, and there's a savoir-faire, of course, with all those sauces, the little details, making the sauce thousands and thousands of times. So after a while, you don't miss it. You can see what is happening. And his beurre blanc was very light, a big emulsion. We spent, 5 minutes whisking that batter and to make it lighter. And with the shallots were really finely, very finely chopped, cooked very slowly for a couple of hours, and uh, it was just super delicious. It was very tasty. It was just a perfect accompaniment to a fish from the river, or a turbot, or a sole, or something like
We are only 10 minutes in, and you're already making me very hungry, Gabriel.
that.
And you successfully avoided that question: whose beurre blanc was better, your
Oh,
grandmother's or the Michelin-starred
well,
chef's?
my grandmother was the best beurre blanc I had eaten in my youth, and after that, no, her beurre blanc was really a beautiful homemade beurre blanc. And I can really honestly say that, if in Melbourne, say, if a home cook, that's where I live, wants to make a sweet pastry, get some good butter, go in a good fruit shop, select the best raspberries, you know, make a crème pâtissière, with some fresh eggs and good milk, and then, add some really good cream. That home cook can make a raspberry tart as good as the top restaurant of Melbourne. And so you see, those people, when you cook at home and they make a coq au vin, or a hare, or a beurre blanc sauce, it was just amazing. Like you can't think at the time of something better. Albert Augereau's beurre blanc was really, really good. Even Paul Bocuse, that I got to know later on, like about 45 years ago, he said, Gabriel, what was Albert's secret? He asked me. and they knew each other well. And I said, it was the local shallot, it was the local batter, and his whisk movement, that was just incorporating, putting some hair, that emulsion, so it was not too heavy, and it was just brilliant. And that serving it in a warm sauce boat, and making sure that the fish is not boiling hot, never serving it on something too hot, the plate not too hot. It's all of that in the top restaurant makes the difference.
When you went to this restaurant as an apprentice,
Yes.
what was the first role that they got you doing? I can picture in my head that you might be there washing dishes or peeling potatoes or something along those lines. What was the first role that you were doing?
Actually, the very first job I did that morning of 4th of October 1971 was peeling potatoes. And because at that time, there's a generation thing, but at that time, with every portion of fish you serve the pomme anglaise. Pomme anglaise. So you had some bench potatoes, and you peel them, and it really showed me how to peel a potato quickly. There's certainly a choreography of movement even to peel potatoes. And then after that, he was next to me, and then he was turning the pomme anglaise himself. That chef, I was lucky. He was already 57 when so it's lucky to work with a chef of that age, because at that age, you're really, really good cook when, regional cook. It's younger chef can be good cook, but with lots of younger chefs, they can be brilliant, they can be very creative, but there is lots of a hit and miss thing, and they want to jump from something to another. They never, it takes them a while to really go into depth, into stay still for a while, continue to learn to perfect that dish. Uh, when a chef has been of this age, and you know, his father was a chef, his grandfather was a chef. His grandfather, I think it was his grandfather, worked in the brigade with Escoffier. So you can imagine the intelligence of, you know, of that. Suddenly, you share with your son, your grandson, and so on.
What was work life like in a restaurant then? I mean, especially in France, because we have this romantic notion of restaurants when it comes to France and bistros and the tradition. But actually working in a restaurant, what was that like?
Well, it was hot. It was very hot.
No air conditioning?
No, no, no. But during my apprenticeship, at least there was windows, because in the country, you had a really magnificent building, and you had the kitchen on the side. In my second job in Paris, it was on the ground. But the common thing between my apprenticeship and the second job is that the kitchen was still with charcoal. So in the morning, we had to get up early, because in my first restaurant, it was also a small hotel, a charming hotel where people would spend the night in the country. You have to. So at about 7 o'clock in the morning, you had to go and get some charcoal in the back of the garden, the building, bring it and put it in the trémie, the place where you put the charcoal, and get the fire going. And then, so the days were very long, because it was really like from 7 in the morning until 11:30 at night, sometimes a bit earlier in winter, but in summer, people ate later. A little break in the afternoon, if you were lucky, but there usually was a chef that was staying, and if you had done something silly, like a mistake, usually were the ones staying in the afternoon. And in the afternoon, you made things like biscuits, like des tuiles aux amandes. You made some more ice cream. Sometimes you cleaned the copper pans. You made a paste and cleaned that. But in terms of preparation, it was a very different time. You never got anything portioned. You got the fish with the guts. You got the pheasants with the feathers. In winter, like in winter. In France, you got the hare, the wild rabbit, the pheasants, the partridge with the feathers. That was an enormous job. Even at Christmas, we got the turkeys with the feathers. So you had to do that. Not only that, you made all your own pastry. So puff pastry, sweet pastry, choux pastry. You made your own ice cream. every top restaurant had already a Carpigiani ice cream machine, and you made, you always made a vanilla ice cream. You always made some sorbets. Uh, in the region where I was, we made the most extraordinary fruit sorbets from the local gardens with fresh raspberries, with fresh strawberries. So we would make a syrup. We made champagne sorbet with Italian meringue. So the mise en place was enormous, enormous. The pâtés and the terrines and things like that. So basically, the hours were, like whatever, 16 hours, very common. In summer, there was a season, people were on holidays. So we worked as apprentices, we worked 7 days a week for 3 months. Maybe in the middle of it, one would have a day off because something happened and whatever, um, because it was a quiet day or there was whatever. But apart from that, you work really hard. 1 day off a week. I used to go to work hitchhiking because there was no direct transport, and that was once a week. I slept in the attic. We were locked at the weekend because as young fellows, you wanted to go out and your boss, you wanted you to keep fresh for the next day. So it was different. I didn't die.
You went to London at one stage and actually worked in a five-star hotel restaurant.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. I worked for the Savoy Company. So it was the Barclay Hotel. It was the newest hotel of the group. So the Savoy Company at the time had the Savoy Hotel, the Claridge, the Connaught, uh, and the Barclay Hotel. And it was a very classic cuisine with big pots of stocks. There was about 35 of us in the kitchen with a boulanger, a baker, with a garde-manger with several people. With the Queen was a regular guest for function. Um, there was a gourmet restaurant called Le Perroquet, uh, which was a fabulous restaurant. And in the evenings, it was open late at night. We had Perry Como coming and playing with Ray Charles. After their show, they would come and there would be all those parties. Suddenly you had a function. You had 20 boxes, of caviar going, and you made all those toasts, the smoked salmon. That was the luxury of the time, of course. And then, so it was not such a refined cooking as what I had done in my apprenticeship and my second restaurant in Paris, which was a seafood restaurant. But it was the first time I was working in a big brigade, and it was refined, but it was, like the numbers were bigger. Where in France it was more like really à la carte, very soigné, very, the details. There it was, very good, but with a large number of chefs working at everything.
And so, how was your English then when you went to France? Where had you learnt English?
I had done English at school until I was 16, and when I did my exam to become a chef to pass, I had taken the option English because you got better notes. It was the beginning where at the time the chefs like Paul Bocuse, like Michel Guérard, like the top chefs of that time, they were starting to travel a lot. And also remember, Escoffier was in London like 100 years before, whatever. And so it was really understood that it was a bonus for a chef to learn foreign languages. So I studied a bit more English during my apprenticeship just for the sake of keeping it. Also, during my apprenticeship, there was lots of English on the Loire Valley. The English tourists really love the Loire Valley because historically we share the king, and all of that. So they would come in pilgrimage. They would stay in that country hotel, have the most amazing meal of their life for half the price of what they could eat in England at that time, because the life was expensive in England and in France. Country France was not. So for them, it was like heaven.
I mean, it's still the same today. Travel around the French countryside myself,
Yeah,
and am amazed that you can stop in places and have a or 3 course lunch that ends up being a 5 course lunch because they throw in
yeah,
an amuse bouche and there's something before
yeah.
dessert, and it can cost 25-30 euro, and it will be amazing. And you can't do that in Australia.
No, it's the price of a bad lunch, a bad main course for lunch with a glass of ordinary wine,
Yes,
25
yes.
euros. Yeah.
I know. Back in Paris, you worked for, and I want to get his name correct. Is it Alain
Yes.
Senderens? Is that correct?
Sanderins. Yes.
Senderens.
Alain Sanderins.
He
Yeah.
had a 3-star Michelin restaurant that you
Yeah.
worked at in
Yeah.
Paris. What was that experience to work in a 3-star Michelin restaurant?
And he was 37 when I worked with him. Just so you can see the talent there. He had a great training, and he was extremely talented, and he was a thinker. It was that generation where you stop just cooking the same dish, and you really starting to be creative. And he was passionate about all cookbooks and history and cultures, and those chefs, that generation of chefs, they started to visit Japan, they visited Asia, and then suddenly they came back with some ideas, keeping still a cuisine that was really French at the core, but with certainly a lighter presentation, a better use of vegetables. He was the first one to use a steamer to steam vegetables, a dry steamer where you put, and so the technology was really coming to the forefront. Um, and his dishes were just amazing. Very small restaurant next to the Musée Rodin. At the time, we used to serve like 35, 40 people. Not a very big kitchen, but there was 2 levels of kitchen, and everything was interesting, and he was an interesting communicator. He was a thinker that was able to share with people uh, what he was doing. He didn't really spend much time cooking as such, but he was in the kitchen, but he was telling us a little bit like a musician telling to the first violin, listen, put a little bit more, emotion into that. So, I want this like that, and his role was really to, and that's the role of the chef. It's the chef. The cuisine is like an orchestra. A chef that is in a cuisine that is cooking at the stove, a top chef, it's a bit of a waste. Really, you need to train the people to make sure that everything is coming together. And then at the end, of course, you look, you touch, you taste, and make sure that it's perfect. But you need a team. You can't do it on your own. You need a team in the kitchen.
And it's said that he was the modern creator of food and wine pairings. What does that mean? We associate that you always had good wine in France and good food.
Yes, yeah.
So you would assume that they would just always be paired together. So what did he do to become this modern creator of food and wine pairings?
Well, to start with, he had a really good connection. He worked with someone called Jacques Puiset on the Loire Valley that was a professor that written books on taste, and like he really took it as a scientific approach. And so they spent a lot of time together. He had a knack, Alain Sanderins, to get some good stuff. So he had a good, several good sommeliers. And then at that time, you also had all those new winemakers doing organic and biodynamic, and people creating wines that, suddenly that were so transparent, pure. Um, and they stopped thinking that with cheese you have red wine, and with or port, and with fish you have a white wine, and with that fish you get just that white wine and nothing else. And they put a lot more dimension. So really, they studied the nuances of the wine, the nuances of the dish, and sometimes they just wanted to bring something, a marriage of the day sometimes, because the chef had used a bit of tarragon with that fish rather than just, parsley. So suddenly the wine asks to change. They might have something that will work well. And it's a science, of course, it's experience. You need to drink a fair bit. You need to have a good memory of flavor. And Alain Sanderens was really fabulous. And after the restaurant where I worked was next to the Musée Rodin, after that he moved to La Madeleine, to Lucas Carton restaurant, which was a restaurant in which he had worked like 30 years earlier or something like that. And that he had the space to he had a bar on the first floor where he could have a club, serving the most exquisite wines and pairing in Paris, luckily in Paris, you see, there's such a market. There's the money. People will be happy, and people order some amazing bottles of wine. So you have got to make sure that if they order an amazing bottle of wine, you have got an amazing dish.
I learnt my lesson at Tetsuya's in Sydney. I had the food and wine pairing there, and unfortunately, it was the first time I'd ever done that. I was only a young'un. I finished every glass of wine.
Yeah.
So when you have 8 or 9 courses, I think it was, and there's a glass for every course, let's just say I don't remember much of the evening, which is a terrible shame because it's one of the most amazing meals that I possibly had in my life.
Yes, of course. Now, you know what? I tend to agree with you. There's a point here. To me, some of the chefs, the modern chefs, who are so talented, like Paul Bocuse was very clever. The modern chefs sometimes say, "Oh, he's classic," and things like that. He was very clever, and he used to. I remember I got to know him well. He used to say, "Look at this plate is stupid. The fork that cannot hold on the side, you cannot get the bottom of the plate. It's very, very hard to reach the food." And like when you are served so many courses, you can't remember the first one, and it's just so many flavors in each courses. I think it's a mistake myself for any restaurant to serve more than say 6 courses. You will see the people as you age, it's far too much. It's just first you quite easily to become unwell towards the end of the meal because it's just an overload.
In 1977, you moved to Australia. There's a reason why you moved to Australia. What would that be?
Well, I met Angie, my wife, in Paris when I was working with. At the time, I was working with Alain Sanderens. Just before Alain Sanderens, I did my national service in the NATO forces in West Germany, and then after that, I came and I placed an ad at the uni at the Sorbonne, saying, looking for to share an apartment with English-speaking people. And I didn't get an English-speaking. Yes, I did, but it was a French woman who was a friend of Angie, my wife. So we met through that. We met in 1976, and she was in Paris. She was au pair, although she was 28. She was already a qualified language teacher. But being Australian in Paris, there was no working permit. So she had to be au pair in order to stay in Paris. And she was studying at La Sorbonne at the time, doing some further studies. So we fell in love. We went to work in London, in England for a short while. I got a job with Raymond Blanc as his sous chef, but the money was bad. Angie could not get a job as a language teacher in England, so we decided to come to Australia in 1970, where both of us could work.
So when you arrived in Australia, did you go into a kitchen then? So you were working in restaurants in Australia?
I needed to get a job because I didn't have any money. So I just took the first job. We moved to Adelaide. Angie worked in Adelaide as a teacher before. We moved to Adelaide. I got a second job in a restaurant. I didn't know if it was good or bad, and it was pretty bad. Well, because after working in 3 stars restaurant,
Oh, I can imagine. Yes.
and remember it's the 70s, so it was not sophisticated.
Yes.
For some people would have thought it was okay, but it was a bit of a shock. So I stayed there for about 6 weeks, and then I got a job in a French restaurant as the sous chef, and I stayed there for a few months. But it was lovely. The chef was lovely. but the second partner was not lovely, so there was dispute, and I decided to freelance straight away, advertise my services for cooking for private dinner parties. And little by little, and that was just a gamble, Angie was working. I went to visit the press. I went to the newspapers, to the television, to the radio, saying, this is what I do. I got a little bit of publicity. Someone on television asked me if I would cook a dinner for her. In that dinner, Bernard King was there.
Another one of my food icons. I actually met him,
Yeah,
and he was a character.
but it was okay. You know what? We got on really well. Um, we had a good time. He was, of course, older than me. He invited me quite a number of times to go on his show, television show, and he was the only one practically ever, Andrew, that would tell me, Gabriel, look at this camera when this happened, and no, this one, be careful with that. Don't worry about this one. At that time, nobody told you anything. You know, you did it and you did it wrong. You were not looking at the. Bernard understood all of that. He was a performer. He wanted to do things well. He liked my cooking. You know, I think he also liked me as a young fellow.
Well, yes,
You know,
it didn't help that he was a handsome French lad.
no, we had lots. Basically, it was good company, and he was encouraging. I'm little by little, I established myself cooking for private dinner parties, and I could really do well. Each time I would do a dinner, people would ask for the recipes. Then I started a few classes. People asked me to write articles for newspapers. Um, and then after all of that, I was just starting to make a living. It was now after 2, 3 years, I decided to publish a cookbook.
Actually, that leads me to my next question because cookbooks are a passion of mine. I have a few of yours.
Thank you. Merci.
Not an autographed copy though, so we'll have to rectify that next time I'm in Melbourne or you're in France. What was the inspiration behind doing your first cookbook then?
I think I came at the right time. There was a food revolution in Australia. I came with a background of a modern cuisine. I was young, you know. We forget when we are older, we didn't realize how popular we were when we are young because of our youth, because of our energy. I could speak about cooking, and we went to see publishers, and publishers say, "Who are you? No, we don't know you." Blah blah blah. So we decided to publish the book ourselves. I was lucky. One of my clients, for whom I was cooking dinner parties, was a big printer in Adelaide, and he said, "Listen, we print your book. We have got the setup to put your book together, and we'll do it for you." And at that time, it was we had meetings every several days and looked at everything, and then we published the book. And he said, if after 6 months you have not reimbursed the first printing, then we will take over the stock and we will find ways to sell it through our network. And the book was successful. It was not, the first book. I think we sold 7,500 copies, which was not too bad. But we broke even, and that really gave me a national reputation, because from Adelaide was a good place, but it was not the center of Australia. You had to be really ideally in Sydney, because the press was mostly in Sydney, or Melbourne. Melbourne was good too. My wife Angie is from Melbourne. After in 1981, we decided, just after the publishing of the book, to move to Melbourne, to just get going in a different dimension, and also because we had a child by that time. Sebastian was born in Adelaide, and we wanted to have grandparents, not far.
You mentioned Bernard before and getting into TV, and of course, so many Australians will know you from TV. What was the first TV show on your own then that you did?
Well, the very first one was actually a pretty good show. It was an 8 half-an-hour series for the ABC called The Good Food Show. And it was a lifestyle show, if you want, really like practically the first of its type. It was in the 80s. It was 1986. And it was filmed on film, not on video. produced by the CSIRO, and I went around Australia to talk about fresh vegetables, to talk about the importance of eating fish and a wide variety of food and making good bread and things like that. And it was shown in the evening, so a little bit of a prime time. First, it was shown on Saturday morning, and then the ABC showed it, like at 5 o'clock on the Sunday, which was not too bad, because at that time networks didn't believe that you could have a television show prime time. Later on, I did the show called What's Cooking, which was a serious, we used to record 18 recipes a week that I would prepare in one day. The shoot was in one day. Um, and at that time, we worked a lot. I had built a kitchen in the studio. They didn't believe in having a test kitchen. They thought you could do everything on the bench. And I said, no, you can't. We're doing lots of cooking there. And then at the time I said, it's popular during the day. Our ratings were almost as good as the midday show with Ray Martin and 100 people working on the show with an orchestra. Why can you give us a spot in the evening? And at the time, hey, who do you think you are? Cooking will never be on primetime television. That's what I was told. And of course, you were involved with MasterChef, and you know how popular those shows are.
How fabulous and wonderful is Gabriel Gaté? What an amazing experience hearing him tell us about his history and how he became a chef and moved to Australia. For those of us in Australia, we know and love him, and he's been in our hearts and our stomachs for many years. But for those not that don't know him, well, now you know why we love him so much. Next week, we're going to explore more about his television career and his favourite French subject, which is seafood, of course. If you like Fabulously Delicious, then please do follow me wherever you follow podcasts. I'm Andrew Pryor, and my motto in life is, whatever you do, you should do it fabulously. So, join me every week for more Fabulously Delicious. And I'll see you next week for part 2 of Fabulously Delicious with my wonderful guest, Gabriel Gaté. À bientôt and bon app!